In the next set of videos, we're going to be going over organic molecules and organic chemistry. Well, the common term organic has a lot of different meanings. It can be relating to or derived from living matter, such as organic soils. In food and farming methods, it can mean produced or involving production without the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, or other artificial agents. When we refer to organic molecules in organic chemistry, these are molecules that contain carbon and hydrogen. For example, carbon dioxide is not organic. Why isn't it organic? It contains carbon, but it doesn't contain hydrogen also. So this molecule is considered to be inorganic. There are four major classes of organic molecules. These are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In this video, we're going to be focusing on carbohydrates, and then other videos will focus on the lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates are composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms and include the sugars and starches. Basic function is for energy of our bodies. The ratio CHO is nearly 1 to 2 to 1, meaning that for every carbon atom, there are 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen atom. That 1 to 2 to 1 is the ratio of a carbohydrate. Well, if you look at water, it's 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. That's the ratio of water. The name carbohydrate means carbon hydrated with water. If you look at a typical carbohydrate like this right here, C6H12O6, that's the ratio of carbon to hydrogen and oxygen. And if you reduce this down, you have 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. Basically, you have carbon hydrated with water, hence the name carbohydrate. When you look at the classification of carbohydrates, the classification is based on size. We're going to see that there are monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. The monosaccharides, or the simple sugars, or simple carbohydrates, contain 3 to 7 carbon atoms, and examples of these include glucose, fructose, and galactose. You want to make sure you star these. You can give these as examples of monosaccharides. Well, you'll notice the chemical formula for glucose, fructose, and galactose are all C6H12O6. And usually when we see C6H12O6, it means blood sugar or glucose. But there are other molecules that have the same ratio. What's the difference between these? It's the way that atoms are arranged. So if you look at glucose, it has the same number of carbons and hydrogens and oxygens as galactose and fructose, but they're arranged differently. Chemicals that have the same molecular formula, but differ in their arrangement of atoms are called isomers. For example, heart and earth. These are 2 words that have the same letters, but they're arranged differently, and it gives you an entirely different meaning. That's like these isomers. They have all the same letters and all the same amounts, but they're arranged differently. Disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides that are hooked together, and oftentimes these can also be classified as simple sugars and simple carbohydrates. Examples, you want to make sure you know these examples of disaccharides. We have maltose, sucrose, and lactose. You should also know what the 2 monosaccharides that are linked together to form this disaccharide are. So maltose consists of glucose and glucose. This is maltose here. Sucrose, or table sugar, it has a glucose linked to a fructose. Lactose is going to have glucose linked to galactose, and lactose is known as milk sugar. Now, common to all of these disaccharides is glucose. It's just hooked to a different molecule. Now, you might have heard of lactose intolerance. Well, this is a person that produces insufficient amounts of an enzyme called lactase. Well, the enzyme lactase, which is produced by our cells of our small intestine, breaks down the disaccharide lactose, known as milk sugar, into glucose and galactose. Well, if you don't have enough of this enzyme, then you can't break down the lactose into glucose and galactose and absorb these monosaccharides through the GI tract. So that lactose continues on to the large intestine. Within the large intestine are lots of bacteria that love that lactose, and they'll use the lactose as an energy source. And as they're using that lactose, they're going to be producing lots of gas and acids, which can cause bloating and gas and diarrhea, really explosive diarrhea, depending on how much milk the person takes in who's lactose intolerant. How can somebody who's lactose intolerant be able to use lactose and be able to take in milk? Well, they can put enzymes on the milk. For example, on ice cream, you can have lactase and put that in there, and it'll break down. Those enzymes will break down the lactose for you. Or you just have lactose-free milk. Interestingly, when we go through the cell, we're going to talk about epigenetics and turning on and off genes. So you can have somebody who makes lactase in the first part of their life, early years, and they're able to digest milk. And then later on, maybe in their teens or early 20s, that gene for making lactase turns off. And then they become lactose intolerant. Epigenetics plays a big part in what genes get expressed and what genes don't get expressed. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the cell. Polysaccharides consist of many monosaccharides bound into long chains, or a polymer. And it's referred to as complex carbohydrates. 3 really important polysaccharides that we're going to be dealing with are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. And these are all built of the monosaccharide known as glucose. Let's take a look at these. Star this. Glycogen is a storage form of glucose in animals. What does glycogen consist of? Glycogen consists of many glucose molecules hooked together. We find large stores of glycogen in our liver and our skeletal muscle. And this glycogen can be broken down into individual glucose units and used for energy. For example, if you have somebody who's getting ready to run a marathon and they want a carbo load, they have that spaghetti the night before. What are they taking in? Well, they're taking in lots of starch with this spaghetti, which consists of glucose molecules hooked together. And then your body breaks those apart as you digest it. It absorbs the glucose, goes to your cells, and for example, your liver will take that glucose, hook it together to form glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose in your cells. And then when your body needs that energy, the liver can break down its glycogen into glucose and release it back into the blood. Glycogen differs from starch and cellulose in that the chains that you see here in glycogen have branches. So the glucose branches in these various parts of glycogen molecule. Starch, star this, is a storage form of glucose in plants, usually unbranched, although some forms of starch can contain branches, but for our purposes, starch is unbranched, and all the glucose molecules are oriented in the same direction. What I mean by that is that when you look at starch, this part right up here, the molecule of glucose, that's the CH2OH. And if you look at this, all of the glucose are oriented in the same direction. All the CH2OH are up here on the top of the molecules that make up glucose that are attached. Are on the upper part here of the glucose molecule. Well, when you look at cellulose, cellulose is a structural component of plant cell walls, such as wood. The orientation of glucose is a little different. Every other sugar molecule is upside down. So when you look at cellulose, CH2OH here, the next glucose molecule is down here with a CH2OH. So it looks like this right here, and this here. That's cellulose. Well, because of this orientation of the glucose molecules that are linked together, we don't have an enzyme to break this bond here. We do have enzymes that will break this bond if the glucose is in this orientation. Like I say here in glycogen, see how the CH2OH is oriented in the same orientation? We have enzymes to break that down. We don't have enzymes to break down cellulose. Since humans cannot digest cellulose, it's eliminated in the feces, and cellulose provides fiber or bulk to our diet. Now, insoluble fiber bulks up the waste material as it moves through the colon, and it prevents constipation. It helps the colon to squeeze and exercise those muscles of the colon and small intestine as well, and it helps move that waste products through the colon faster. Grazing animals and termites, they have certain bacteria and or protozoans inhabit their digestive tract. And they help break down the cellulose, providing glucose to the cow and the termite. They have that symbiotic relationship going on. This carbohydrate is called chitin. It's not called chitin, it's called chitin. And chitin is a derivative of glucose that's similar to the polysaccharide cellulose. Where we find this is it forms the tough exoskeleton or outer covering of invertebrates, such as in crustaceans like this lobster here, insects, arachnids, such as spiders, and the cells of certain fungi. Certain surgical thread can be made of chitin. It's used to make strong, flexible surgical thread. When insects get bigger, they have to break out of this chitin shell, and then they can enlarge. Shown here, chitin forms the exoskeleton of arthropods. Chitin is healthy for humans. Chitin is a valuable dietary fiber and prebiotic, nutrition for probiotics, which benefit gut flora. Adding chitin to your diet is easy. Just add edible crickets, roasted mealworms to your meals, and cricket powder for baking and adding to shakes. They take up crickets, they grind them up, and oh my gosh, you have this valuable dietary fiber. Fun fact, chitin is the second most abundant natural polysaccharide on Earth after cellulose. You can get these things like insect snacks, where you have larvettes, you have crickets, and they can be flavored. That adds valuable chitin and nutrition to your diet. This is something you can do on date night. Take your date some insect or arachnoid candy. They will love it. Or even better, let's say you have, that special someone, and then you can take some of these and sprinkle them on their salad, and then just wait for the science to happen. Don't tell them you're sprinkling it on the salad. Just wait for them to discover it on their own, and then you could talk about the valuable nutrition that they're getting from this chitin and how it's a valuable, not only nutritionally, but you're going to have all this fiber in your diet. Let's test our knowledge. Go ahead and pause the video and answer these questions. Here are the answers. Pause the video and answer these questions. Here are the answers. Pause the video and answer the questions. Here are the answers. Pause the video and answer the questions. Here are the answers. And this concludes the video, and we'll move on to the next video and continue on with organic chemistry.